The climate funding deadlock is still just that, a deadlock. Like its predecessors Sharm el-Sheikh and Dubai, Baku didn't unlock the cash. In the end, COP29 in Azerbaijan just made another pledge, a $300 billion annual kitty for poorer countries fighting climate aftershocks. Delegates from Africa, the world's least polluter and worst hit, returned home disappointed again. This week on the program, we ask, does Africa need to rethink its dependence on the global north for adaptation and mitigation cash that just isn't there? Could deepening South-to-South cooperation on climate offer the much-needed respite? I'm Penina Karibe. Welcome to Talk Africa. We have a lot to discuss, so let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining me here in studio is Fadhel Kaboub, Senior Advisor with PowerShift Africa. Now, I'll start with you, Fadhel. What were the key highlights, sticking points and controversies at this year's COP29 in Baku?
Well, as you know, COP29 in Baku was supposed to be the climate finance COP. And our governments from the Global South went in with a reasonable, modest request to cover the basics of climate adaptation and climate action, and that was $1.3 trillion request. We spent 2 weeks of negotiations without seeing a single number offered by the Global North. So instead of coming in with a number on day one that we can use to start the negotiations and to have negotiations in good faith, face to face, we waited until the very last day of the COP and then finally got the $250 billion offer from the Global North, which was immediately rejected as a joke by the Global South, by the G77, the Africa Group of Negotiators, and everybody said this is not even a joke, this is an insult. And we ended up essentially with a last-minute push by the Global North to force an agreement that was objected to by India, by Nigeria, by Malawi, by so many other countries, and force this agreement over $300 billion that will be delivered in 2035. And it's $300 billion of low-quality finance. So to put things in context, $300 billion delivered in 2035, if you convert that in today's money, that will be $175 billion. And to put that number side by side with how much Africa is paying in debt service in 2024 alone, we're paying $163 billion in debt service in 1 year alone. So just this 1 year alone will wipe out essentially whatever this thing we call climate finance that came out of COP29. And then finally you have the quality of this climate finance. From an African perspective, we wanted high quality transformative climate finance because for us it's development finance, and that should have come in 3 categories. Number 1, cancellation of all climate related debts that many of our countries have accumulated because of the intensifying climate events that we're experiencing. Number 2, grants, not loans and further economic entrapment. And most importantly, number 3, transfer and sharing of life-saving technologies to allow us to manufacture and deploy the building blocks of climate resilience and adaptation, starting with the renewable energy infrastructure, clean transportation infrastructure, clean cooking infrastructure. All of this is real green transformative industrialization that also happens to be the kind of climate action we want. So if you assess what happened in Baku, you realize that this is a failure, that we didn't get the quantum that we wanted, we didn't get the quality of climate finance, and we ended up with the same kind of false solutions and dangerous distractions that the Global North is imposing on the rest of the world year after year.
If I may just follow up on something that you said this was a COP on finance. I have seen some people argue that perhaps the reason why there wasn't really a commitment on the 1.3 trillion that had been suggested by the Global South was because the delegates that were there, the government representatives that were there, were environment ministers. They didn't have the finance ministers that were primarily supposed to have handled this issue. Do you think that could have contributed to this figure being how it was delivered in the end?
Now, when it comes to the Global North countries, it's true that they send their climate envoys or environmental ministers, but this is, at the end of the day, this COP meeting was not about climate finance. It was not even about climate. It was about an economic and geopolitical hierarchy that was not meant to be disrupted. Because if we really get the kind of transformative climate finance that we're talking about to truly unleash the full renewable energy potential of the African continent, the way we've described it today, then we're essentially escaping the bottom of the global hierarchy, economically speaking and geopolitically speaking. And that is not something that a lot of people in the global north perceive as an opportunity. They perceive it as a threat, as a risk to be managed. So that's why we never get the kind of quality transformative finance that we're talking about, or the sharing of life-saving technologies to allow us to unleash the renewable energy potential that we have in Africa. So the fact that they sent environment ministers doesn't mean that the rest of their cabinets are not fully aware of what these climate negotiations are about.
Africa has 60% of the world's best solar potential, but just over 1% of installed capacity. 9 million additional jobs could be created in the energy sector by 2030 through an African transition to renewable energy. And this, of course, creates up to 5 times more jobs than fossil fuels. So it's not just solar. We have critical minerals used to produce renewable energy. Question is, how can Africa tap into these significant resources?
Well, just to add to the numbers that you laid out here, according to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Africa can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs by 2040 with existing renewables technologies and completely replace all the continent's fossil fuel exports. So this is technically within reach. Yet we attract less than 2% of global financing that goes towards renewables. And most of the investment in renewables that we see on the continent is either to produce green electricity to be exported to Europe, or to produce green hydrogen to be exported to Europe, or to produce green products assembled with green electricity on the continent, but those products will be consumed somewhere else on the planet. So not to put in place the building blocks of development and prosperity. And the reason why earlier I mentioned that this is about geopolitics, this is about power, is because if you unleash Africa's potential to produce 1,000 times our anticipated energy needs, then it's as if you've taken OPEC, the OPEC countries, with their economic weight, with their weight in the energy system and the geopolitical system, and multiplied that by 1,000 times. That's Africa's potential in terms of an energy powerhouse, an industrial powerhouse, and a geopolitical heavyweight. That is the risk that is perceived by others. That is the threat that is being perceived by others, which is why we don't get the financing and we don't get access to the manufacturing technology to unleash this potential. And that's why I go back to that bargain of the century, because we need access to the manufacturing technology more than the financing, because we have the resources, we have the labor, we have the economies of scale. We need the joint venture partnership to contribute with in-kind to deliver the manufacturing technology to the African continent. Once you unleash that, Africa will no longer be in the vulnerable position that we're in economically and geopolitically.
So, Fadhel, unfortunately, this is where we are. No proper funding forthcoming from the global north, and yet facing a climate crisis that Africa knows all too well just how impactful it is. So how can African countries then chart their own climate path, and where should they start? Or are we done for? What kind of strategies and partnerships do we need to enable us as Africa come up with strategies and chart our own path when it comes to the climate agenda?
It's a big mistake to think of this as just a climate agenda, because from an African perspective, this is a development and transformation agenda, because simultaneously the kinds of policies that we need to put in place to address the climate challenge on the adaptation front, such as strategic investments in food sovereignty and agroecology, strategic investments in renewable energy production for the 600 million people who have no access to electricity as we speak, and strategic investments in green, transformative, high value-added industrial policies at the continental level to put in place the renewable energy, clean cooking, clean transportation infrastructure. All of this is simultaneously economic transformation and repositioning within the global economic hierarchy, and it's also climate adaptation and climate resilience policies. So we can't separate the two. The challenge is that, unfortunately, many of our governments actually go into the COP negotiations thinking that this is about climate. and sending environment ministers instead of sending an entire cabinet worth of ministers, including finance ministers and trade and industry ministers, to negotiate the kind of transformation that we need, not just in the COP process for climate, but also on debt and development and other multilateral spaces. This is about economic transformation, not just climate action.
All right, thank you very much for that. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A very big thank you to our guests, Fadhel Kaboub, the Senior Advisor at PowerShift Africa. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X, and you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Penina Karibe, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.